Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm going to be your host today and the moderator. I'm a member of the Committee 100 and happen to be the chair of the Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative that this particular program is part of. Just briefly about the history and upcoming events. This program was started about 3.5 years ago with the idea that to the extent that we could communicate the research, the thoughts, advice, etc., related to career ceilings for Asian Americans, that would be a good addition to the landscape. This is, I believe, now the 40th event that we've held, and they've been a mixture of of researchers who presented their data on how bad it is and what the explanations are. We have people from different industries talking about what it's like in their particular industry, whether it's media or so forth. We've had millennials talk, who are just panels of just millennials talk about the perspectives from millennials. And we had actually 3 sets of parents from Indian American, Korean American, Chinese Americans talking about what it looks like from the parents' point of view and in the changing generations. We all then shifted to having some events which were problem solving, where we get people together, leaders together, to come up with ideas of things that haven't yet been done that could be done, and we've been implementing those. And then last, we just starting in December, 2 different masterclass series. One on maintaining, the DEI issue and equity initiatives. So more tutorials for those people who are managing that in their companies, organizations, and the other focused on individuals. So, what can individuals do to succeed? And we're going to have a series of those. The first one of the individual was in December, where we talked about how do you identify stereotypes and bias, and what do you do about it. In terms of upcoming events, we have one tomorrow, which is a master class for individuals, which is on developing a personal brand, which is not talked about that much. People talk about a lot about mentoring, this and that, but actually interesting, creating a personal brand is a very important skill, no matter what you do in life, but certainly as it relates to succeeding as an Asian American. We have 2 more coming up. We have one on how to network, which is obviously an individual masterclass. And then we're going to have one on Asian American career ceilings in the real estate industry. So those invitations are going out. Those of you interested in developing a personal brand, that's going to be tomorrow night. I am very, very pleased to have our 2 panelists for this session this evening on managing the effectiveness of equity initiatives in the current environment. Notice I have avoided the new curse word DEI, right, and used equity initiatives, and that's part of the issue that we're going to try to talk about now. I mean, that you cannot pick up a newspaper today or periodical without some article talking about either the legal or the activists or the other challenges that people are going through, where they're trying to do the right thing, but also do it in the right context in the current environment. And that's what we hope to achieve today. Despite the challenges facing DEI and employee resource groups, in fact, these organizations around and a lot of the ones that I talk to really are focused on similar goals. And nonprofits also, it's not just corporations. So this is really an important time to reflect on how we can advance effective efforts to advance opportunities for everyone in the current environment. What I'd like to do, though, is I'm not going to read our 2 panelists' bio because I know that was in the invitation. But what I'd like to do is to ask each of our 2 panelists to briefly summarize what they do and what they do, the parts that they do that intersect with the topic that we're going to be addressing today. So in alphabetical order, by last name, Joyce, would you like to start?
No, thank you so much, Peter. And it's a real pleasure to be here today and to be with Jenny, who I have just so much respect for. So I'm at JP Morgan, and I'm the global chair of the research department here. The research department at JP Morgan has 1,000 professionals in 26 different countries. And it covers all aspects of research, including the company research, from equity research, economic forecasting, indexes, quantitative research, all of the FX and rates and commodities forecasting. My own background is macro. I'm a career researcher. I started in graduate school working on Wall Street at the old Solomon Brothers, way before Citigroup, and then Merrill Lynch, way before Bank of America. And I've been at JP Morgan since 1999. When I first joined JP Morgan, they were just creating the first Asian employee networks. I have been the executive sponsor for Aspire, which is Asian Americans reaching for excellence, our employee network. JP Morgan, just given the size of the bank, has a very large Asian employee network. In North America alone, we have 26,000 members. So I have been the executive sponsor probably for around the last 15 years. But in my own work, I spend a lot of time looking at U.S.-China relations. I have spent a lot of time also when I was a student working on Asian American issues. And so I'm on the board of the Asian American Business Development Center. I also am on the board of the Asian Columbia Alumni Association, which is where I did my undergraduate degree. So a lot of my time has been spent, working with Asian employees here and in other external networks as well on some of the things that are common challenges. And a lot of that has overlapped with looking at some of the other business groups that work on women's issues, because I'm also on the steering committee of our commercial and investment banks women's network, which is called Women on the Move here. So real passion, for this topic and how it affects not just JP Morgan, but the industry at large and some of the community groups, that we work with. So just, a real pleasure to be here today and to talk about these issues because there is so much that's in evolution right now.
Peter, you're on mute.
Thank you, Joyce. Could you maybe share your background and your obvious intersection with this topic?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me back to join the Committee of 100. And Joyce, it's really a pleasure to be here with you. It's so critical to have people like yourself in senior leadership roles, taking the important roles of executive sponsor of those groups. So thank you for all you've done. I've spent over 25 years in the work, advancing the work of equal opportunity, both as a litigator, in the government, in the private sector, representing workers, and also as chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission under the Obama administration. In the Biden administration, I started out on day one leading an anti-discrimination enforcement agency called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the Department of Labor, which enforces anti-discrimination requirements and affirmative action, which means proactive barrier removal and not race-based decision-making in the OFCCP context. And then I was there for over 2 years and moved to the White House, where I led a team on racial justice and equity. And I also had the role of the partner at my law firm, where I was for 10 years, leading the diversity, equity, inclusion work there, and also was on an elected diversity, equity, inclusion task force at a think tank, the Urban Institute, when I was there. So I've also had the experience of trying to work from within an organization to identify the opportunities as well as the challenges. And I'm currently doing consulting with an entity called Working Ideal, where in the past, after I left EOC, we will help employers try to think about how they advance their work on equal opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion, while also doing work I'm going to be doing work in the sort of tech, AI, civil rights space as well. So I'm really delighted to have this conversation because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how we advance the next generation of practices in this work going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So those of you in the audience, you can see why this particular combination panelist is very powerful for this issue, because Jenny she has corporate and other issues, but she has very heavily from the government side, and Joyce really from the perspective of someone in industry and that really small company, JP Morgan, right? So, I feel we want to attack the current situation, but I always think it's good to at least take a few minutes and look at history, because history helps you understand where you are today. In fact, the whole DEI effort started many years ago across companies, governments, organizations. There were legislative initiatives, but also actions by universities and schools, all of whom are trying to deal with inequities among ethnic, gender, and other lines. But events over time first accelerated those efforts. Particularly, a lot of people like to cite the George Floyd incident as kind of a trigger that really triggered an increased effort in this area. But then, of course, now more recently, there have been a whole bunch of things that have happened on both Supreme Court, the flurry of Supreme Court rulings, activists, lawsuits, and political party campaigns around these issues. So there's nothing boring about the history of what's been happening in this topic. So perhaps I'd like both of you, because both of you have been involved with this for a long time, maybe to comment on your views of the history of DEI and the more recent events. Either one of you can start first.
Great. Well, I'm happy to share some history and a little bit about the future, and then we'll turn it to Joyce about what she's seen. There's a very large kind of connection between the work of civil rights and equal opportunity and the development of diversity, equity, inclusion practices. So Title VII was passed 60 years ago this past July, and that also created the EOC. And it also ushered in a new set of work to both prevent discrimination and also respond to documented discrimination where there's been litigation to show that's a problem, right? And the objective of all of this work is to understand what are the barriers that are keeping qualified people from having the opportunity to have a job, succeed in the job, get paid fairly. And so the underpinning of equal opportunity, which is very much a core American value, is really at the root of diversity, equity, inclusion work. The agency I led, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, was created initially by an executive order and that was signed by President Johnson. And it has a similar anti-discrimination component to EOC, but in addition, it has what is termed in the executive order affirmative action, but which in practice is quite confusing because it's very different than in the education space that most people are familiar with, where there had been race considerations among other factors in admissions decisions. In the employment space, in the traditional world of equal opportunity, the consideration of race or other protected characteristics is not at all part of diversity, equity, inclusion, right? The goal of the work is to actually understand where a barrier may exist. So OFCCP requires federal contractors to analyze data to see whether they're fully utilizing the qualified available workforce in their geographic area, to look at the trajectory for promotions, to see whether there may be certain groups that are disproportionately getting those opportunities, to do a pay equity audit, to see whether certain groups may be disproportionately paid more than others. So none of those kinds of proactive practices involve the consideration of race to make individual hiring and employment decisions. So what we've seen now, right, as we've seen a backlash against the word DEI, right? Some of the polling has shown like, actually, that's not a good word. Most people have no idea what it is. And so it's critical that we actually define what diversity, equity, inclusion. Many organizations also talk about belonging. The federal government talked about access to make sure the disability community was fully included. So whatever the language, I think it's critically important that organizations are defining for themselves and externally what they really mean. What we saw, and I'll say briefly, after the murder of George Floyd, many organizations made new commitments to address racial inequality, and many were very well-intentioned to create greater change and accountability after employees and other stakeholders expressed frustration at the slow pace of progress. But one challenge we've seen in some, but certainly not all organizations, is this desire to move fast to meet the demand for action and message commitment to external action wasn't always paired with adequate consideration about what the practice change and system changes were needed. So often there was this external commitment, but not always the resources and intentionality to ensure that practices were implemented in a way that really would provide greater fairness and opportunity for all. And so often today, the word DEI or efforts in this space are conflated with race-based decision-making or what is typically viewed as affirmative action. So I think that is in part what has gotten us to this place we are today. But Joyce, I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Those are very helpful. And yeah, you're right. Jenny, words matter. And one of the problems is things get tagged with a certain meaning and it may not necessarily be appropriate. Joyce, can you comment on the history and where we are today?
Yeah, so let me give you just a little bit of background about the history at JP Morgan, because we have 9 different business resource groups, but we only created an Office of Asia Pacific Islander Affairs in 2021, 2022 was the last group to really get formally organized. And so I've been the employee sponsor, but a lot of the initiatives were on, sort of cultural understanding, career development, but they weren't outward into the community the same way that some of the BRGs were organized. And the big catalyst for us was actually Stop AAPI Hate. It brought the community together. It put a focus on working on with community development groups. It put a focus on partnering with other business resource groups and sharing sort of common experiences and strategies. And it made us tackle issues in a much more systematic way. So we created an Asia Executive Forum, which is just the managing directors, because that was a much smaller group than the Asian employee group at large. But there was a sense that the senior leadership had some different issues on what was perhaps keeping them from going further into the C-suite. And then we really expanded into looking at 4 pillars, including at JP Morgan, looking at the diversity of our suppliers. Looking at which community development groups that we were working at, looking at the lending to minority-owned businesses and financial health, and then also doing our own survey data, what we called the Asia Pulse, on at different levels. So really looking at the skew in the demographics on the sort of in the underserved community, but also coming up with an Asian Wealth Initiative strategy in the private bank, with the demographics. So it became something that was much more business aligned rather than something that was just personal about career development and about cultural understanding. But it was, Stop AAPI Hate was the catalyst for that. So it was like, a crisis didn't go to waste. We created, institutions around this and then just began to take a much more systematic look at this. So at JP Morgan, we look at this under 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars that we look at are, start first of all, just as a bank, financial health. And then we look at business growth. A lot of that means just the lending that we're doing to small businesses. Then there's community impact. And then finally, there's careers and skills. The other thing that we have done just much more with over the last few years is partnering with the other BRGs, whether it's our Women on the Move group or whether it's our Black Leadership Forum or Hispanic Leadership Forum. and creating more synergies. But the membership also increased dramatically after the pandemic. So the combination of the pandemic, Stop AAPI Hate, the membership went from about 17,000 to the 26,000 employees that we're at, right now. And so I think, we are at a bit of a turning point now, and I feel like DEI is a bit of what I've seen in research. It reminds me a little bit about like the whole debate around ESG. So we're not ESG as an acronym anymore. We're talking about sustainability. And on DEI, there's now much more of a focus that, look, given some of the way the labels are being thrown around, should we be more focused on what we can really have an impact on with our own employees? So perhaps not have it as externally focused as we had, sort of in the post-pandemic period, and really look at how we can impact our own employees and their sense of belonging and make more of a difference to them. So I feel like it, is something where we've seen, just a lot of different forces that are, impacting organizations on how they think about how they prioritize it, how it's perceived, and also the need to, in a big organization like JP Morgan, look at just sort of the issues that affect senior people versus more junior people. So there's career development and skills, and then there really is just trying to break down the data more. So you have, it looks a little bit like a pyramid at a lot of the big organizations. You have a lot of Asians who are in the more junior positions, and like 60% of Aspire is sort of associates and below. And then the managing directors are only about 8%. And they really have sort of different things that we need to target, just given what some of the issues are. Yeah. So that's a bit of how it evolved at JP Morgan.
Yeah, and actually, Joyce, you make two very, very good points. One is what is clear, as I look across all the different ethnic groups and gender groups, is Asian American movement is way far behind. It got started very, very late relative to pretty much anyone you want, whether it's women or Latinos or whatever it is. So that's part of the problem. But I think you raise sort of indirectly the other distinction, which is this Asia hate thing, right? And part of it is geopolitical, whatever, is there's a unusually large defensive aspect of Asian Americans trying to succeed versus, offensive trying to which it's not true that it isn't true for other ethnic groups, but it's particularly true today, right, for Asian Americans, given the tensions with China and so forth. And obviously that makes it far more difficult to achieve what you want to achieve, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I could even tell sort of, when you looked at different administrations coming in, like I remember when Trump first came in, I would get a lot of comments when I gave a presentation. Oh, well, your English is so good, and where are you really from? Questions that I got in the 1990s, but which kind of had, left the radar and then came back on the radar. And I feel like the same thing happened during the pandemic, that people began to really sort of blur a lot of the issues. And since so much of my job is actually talking about the U.S.-China strategic competition, it does seem to me like, compared to many other things that I talk about, that there are much more personalized comments that come into that discourse than many of the other issues that that I focus on.
Yeah. Shifting to our next question. Oh, by the way, one of the things I'd like to mention to the attendees is we will leave some time at the end for Q&A. And the way we'd like you to do it is just to type in your question into the Q&A chat box, and we'll be able to see the questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Shifting a little bit now, so we talked about history, we talked about what the current situation is, all this very rapid developments recently. Let me ask each of you to comment, Jenny, from your perspective on the government side, Joyce on the business side. How do you think corporations and the government, respectively, have to shift what they're doing and the tactics and the legislators in order to accommodate this shifting, the landscape with regard to the DEI-related issue? And the two of you can answer it in whatever order you wish, right?
Joyce, you want to take that first?
So what do I think that organizations should be doing in the current environment? I think it's been very important to get a lot of the data out there, because there's this perception that Asians are, better educated, better well off, and there's such a dispersion within the Asian American community, which is one of the challenges to organizing it. So, a lot of the first things that we ended up doing was gathering the data, really to show that, look, you have some of also the populations that are below the poverty line compared to other groups, concentrated in the Asian American community. And then we broke down other things like who's registered to vote, who has access to health care. So I think the first thing is that it's very important that you have some of these data points so that you can say, really, this is what the Asian pulse is. And that it's very fact-based, because I think there are a lot of stereotypes, that come with this, or people see just, one segment of, a very broad population that's facing a lot of different, challenges, and some of the differences that also come depending on what part of the country you're in, if you're in a rural versus a more urban area, as well. The other things that I would say were, really quite important was just kind of getting a more activist approach. Just saying, look, how do you get Asians more engaged in the political process itself, and articulating the needs, and being part of that. And that even came down to a micro level at JP Morgan, just the whole issue of a focus on presentation and communication skills for the employee needs as well. That they felt like this is something that has held us back, even though we have some, a lot of the technical skills that are necessary at JP Morgan. We haven't been able to sort of get into as many of the front office roles as we need to, because we need to work on this. So I think the key things in this kind of environment is, can you actually gather the data, have the focus groups, target it to some specific problems that you see in the community. The other thing I would say was very important was the industry networking piece of it. We've been involved with a lot of our clients who are starting their own Asian employee networks, and a lot of the industry associations as well. And finally, I think related to that, and Jenny probably has just spent a lot more time on this, is like, how do you measure the impact? And so a lot of people would say, well, look, if you look at the absolute numbers, the Asian numbers look really good. I said, yes, but if you break down just sort of what the pool was, and who was able to advance, and the percentage, and even some of the commentary around what the areas are necessary for development, there's a lot of stereotyping in there, and there's also just sort of a ratio of promotions that's probably not matching the universe that we have to begin with. So it's sort of like you can only sort of really impact what you can measure, was a big part of what that we've looked at. So I think that we've also, because I'm a research analyst, looked at how we can partner with more of the policy groups. Like at JP Morgan, there's the market research, but there's also the JP Morgan Chase Policy Institute, and the Institute, where we try to put it more in sort of, how do you affect policy, and think about the ways in which we can use the research for policy good as well.
By Joyce, one follow-up question though is, JP Morgan is not like just one company. It's lots of different businesses, and they can be very, very different. Trust my friends who are, I run investment bank. My friends who are in sales and trading absolutely say there's a huge difference between M&A people and traders and research. Has JP Morgan tried to deal with this issue differently based on the differences in the way different businesses are managed and around the world?
I think that it really so many investment banks get organized like in product areas. Mm-hmm. So there are certain things that I've seen just chronically come up, particularly for Asian women. And I know there's a lot of women who have dialed into this, and a lot of it was I remember when I first joined JP Morgan, I was asked to work on something called, like the Asian Task Force. And the question was, why are there so few Asian women who have been promoted to managing director? And this was in the 1990s still, and there were like 3 in the firm.
It was easy to gather the data, right?
Yeah, but then I remember, I ended up talking to one of the managers, and so the way it works here in a lot of banks, somebody writes a summary of you and why you should be promoted, and it's like a 2-page form. You've got to put your business performance and your future potential, all of these different things. And I looked at this 2-page form, and I circled and I had a form. They were like, "This person didn't get through last year. Can you look at the form? I mean, you write research for a living." And so I circled like 4 times on this 2-page form where somebody had said, well, this person has great technical skills, but they can work on their presence. It's their lack of presence that they need to work on. This is the area for development. And, I circled it 4 times in a 2-page form. And I finally called up the manager and I said, look, you're the problem. I mean, you can't say somebody's at the pinnacle of their career and say they have no presence. I don't even know what that means. Does that mean you don't have a personality? So, there's I think it can really vary. Like, I felt like the managing director promotion was actually quite, different than, what you do when you're a VP. And like you said, that tomorrow it's on developing your personal brand. That is really key when you're a vice president in financial services, because it's very programmed. When you're an analyst and associate, you get to a VP where you're front office, and then you need to have a brand, particularly if you're in a front office job where, you're a service industry. And so we spend a lot of time, on different things. So there's you need to offer different things. There's sort of the mentoring, networking part when you're younger. There's developing the personal brand, and then I hate to use the word, this whole thing, like, do you have the presence of somebody who looks like they're in the C-suite, but or has that potential, which I think is also a different question.
Jenny, same overall question, which is, what do you think the government, not just federal, it's, any of the major influencers in government, what they should be doing differently or can be doing differently in the current environment to make good things happen?
Well, I do think this is a time of significant change for the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think Joyce's example really highlights this, that it is often this sort of practice change that we really need to focus to understand why certain people who may be qualified are not advancing, or what about the organizational culture is leading only certain people to think they might have potential to move into leadership. I would agree that across industries, this is a very common issue that the data shows for Asian Americans. So not just in the world of banking, but also in law firms, in tech. EOC issued a report earlier last year now, highlighting some of the data patterns and finding, even in these industries where Asian Americans are very highly represented at lower levels, often very overrepresented at lower levels, you still see significant underrepresentation at the highest levels. And I think Joyce's point is a really important one, that organizations need to understand that they have a role in ensuring individuals get the opportunities that they need to then be successful in the evaluations for promotions. So that, I think, is a critical piece that often, in a review like that, sort of pushing it back on an individual, where a manager has the opportunity to give people the opportunity to develop that presence, to give feedback, to help them, work on that. So I do think we're going to see significant changes in the private sector. Many have done a review post Supreme Court decision on what we call SFFA for short, but Students for Fair Admissions, the Harvard UNC affirmative action decision. It did not actually have any impact on employment. It did not directly address the standards for employment law, but it certainly has had a spillover effect where there have been increased lawsuits, increased challenges by individuals like Robbie Starbucks that are running more publicity campaigns and legal efforts. And we do know there's a new administration coming in that has been very focused on dismantling some of the work around diversity, equity, inclusion. One of my first days on the job, I was charged with President Biden to implement the rescission of a Trump executive order that was on divisive diversity training for federal contractors in the federal government. And so that executive order had suggested that certain kinds of diversity training may be too divisive, certain terms like implicit bias or systemic racism could make people uncomfortable, and that sort of training shouldn't be used. There were, First Amendment challenges that were successful, but this executive order was rescinded, and that was my job at OFCCP to rescind. So and so you saw sort of a significant change, right, from the last administration shifting to making the work of diversity, equity, inclusion actually a core priority of the Biden administration. There were a number of racial justice and equity executive orders, and it became a whole of government mandate that everyone was charged in ensuring the government served everyone, and that across the government, we were fully utilizing the talent. So I do expect that that will significantly change. People might be familiar with the Dismantled DEI Act introduced by then Senator J.D. Vance, which would eliminate all federal DEI programs and end DEI-related funding for agencies, contractors, and organizations. So I think we'll see, like to your point, Peter, we don't know what's going to happen until it happens. There's been reports of potentially over 100 executive orders coming out of this administration. But I do think that whatever happens in terms of the federal government, the large majority of work that fall under this umbrella are fully lawful, and organizations really have the freedom to decide what works best for them to advance their objectives, to fully utilize talent.
Jenny, there's been a lot of rhetoric, right, said during the election and so forth about it. But obviously, one of the things that's true is what a lot of the incoming Trump, appointees or nominees, et cetera, say versus what they actually can do. Could you help the audience understand a little bit about the things that they probably could do if they wanted to, that's consistent with their overall position versus the things that, you can't do because you just physically can't. I mean, like cutting out $1 trillion. Well, then you can't, the math doesn't work, right? But that's what they would do. But it's important to understand what they could do versus what they can't do. Any comments on that?
Sure. There are many systems changes as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, like existing programs that are fully lawful. Recruiting particular communities that have been underserved has generally been recognized as fully lawful because race, gender, ethnicity has not been considered in the actual selection process, but it's a way to ensure that you're considering the full talent. Right, the Department of Education, after the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action came out, issued a Dear Colleague letter explaining to universities that you can have race, ethnicity focused programming. So it might be a bridge or pipeline program designed to help particular communities that have faced barriers. And it can be focused on those particular communities facing a particular part of the country or region or ethnic or racial community, but the program needs to be open to all. Yeah, and that was sort of their bottom line guidance, that where you might have now like an employee resource group, I think the thinking is as long as it's sort of genuinely open to others who want to participate, that those types of efforts are fully lawful. Efforts to understand the data is also fully lawful. I think some people are sometimes afraid to look at their data because they're afraid they might see a pattern or a problem that then they'll have to investigate. But my view has always been it is much better to look under the hood to get ahead of problems so that you have the time to understand what is driving it. Simple disparities doesn't mean it's a discrimination. It just means this is something that is important to investigate. So I do think the kind of work of understanding what might be a barrier, there's research around pay inequity and practices that require negotiation, and there's evidence suggesting women are often less able to negotiate. Often it's a reluctance, but often there's also backlash to women negotiating. So you could redesign practices that heavily weigh negotiation or heavily weigh people having to volunteer without support or encouragement for promotion. So I think there's a lot of the practice design piece that really is fully lawful and important
So you're
to
basically
advance
saying
diversity, equity, and
there's a
inclusion.
lot that they say they want to do, but there's a lot that actually they're not going to be able to change. So the key is to understand that. I want to flip this a little bit on a question that, I'm going to be unfair to the two of you because I didn't put this on the list of questions. But since a lot of the people who are in the audience here are officers in DEI groups or whatever, there's an interesting question, which is, there are a lot of parts of companies, nonprofits, where there's already an established way of doing it. I mean, if you want to be a CFO of a nonprofit or whatever, you don't have to figure it all out from scratch, because over time, there are a whole set of practices of how you manage the accounting part or whatever and audit and so forth. So you don't have, you might make some changes, but you don't have to start from scratch. The issue in DEI and ERG so forth is there was no precedent, right, as to what to do, right? So my question to both of you, which is one, when you started, how did you figure out what to do? Because there were thousands of ways you could do it. But also, what advice would you give to the people in the audience with regard to what benchmarks or what practices so forth they should look to when they figure out how to modify or start their effort? And this is maybe we could start with Joyce.
I think Jenny set up a lot of these points very well for what we're looking at right now, is that you can't exclude other groups. So you kind of look at some of the things which are really common problems across a lot of the different BRGs, and then you partner together. So it makes it much harder for someone to say, well, why are you doing this just for your particular BRG? And so an example is on our women's network here. Years ago, we came up with something called Men as Allies, and we basically said every subcommittee has to have a male on it, because otherwise we're just kind of preaching to the converted already. We get the same leaders who show up and we know they're committed. So we need to do Men as Allies, and we need to encourage them to bring men to the women's events. And for the Asian community, it was kind of the same type of thing. Like, look, a lot of the Black Leadership Forum didn't even think about have awareness on Asian American racism until Stop AAPI Hate.
Mhm.
Like, they just said, like, it doesn't really exist. I was like, well, what do you mean it doesn't exist? And didn't know any of the history of, like, on the Japanese internment and
Right.
very basic things. And I remember going through some of this and putting out Asian American studies speakers, and they had never heard any of it. It just wasn't history that they were used to. So I think the allyship is really important. Can you actually partner with some of your other BRGs, with your other diversity networks, and say that, look, we're all facing some common issues right now? And I think that is to Jenny's point. As long as you don't exclude other people, you can sort of move ahead with that. I think the other thing that was really important at JP Morgan was that you had some things occur that were not just top down, they were organic. And so we had started something that was called Candid Conversations. And basically we said, like, if you're an MD, sign up, and then you're going to lead a circle of people in talking through some of these issues that had come up during the pandemic. Like, I think JP Morgan is kind of famously back in the office, right?
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people who were feeling like, women at one point, just like very insecure about kind of even just traveling into work, because it wasn't as populated, it was more hostile. So we did candid conversations where it was much more organic. People could feel like they could talk to each other more as peers, with somebody kind of managing the conversation, but it's very anonymous. It's not organized like a big group event. Um, and then I think that there's also that you need to sort of make sure that you really partner with your HR department.
Right.
So the HR department might say, look, this is what we're doing for associates, who are going to vice presidents, executive directors who are going to managing directors, and you want to embrace those existing programs, which deal with a lot of the issues that your own BRG deals with, but deals with it across the whole platform, as well, so that you talk about the commonalities you have rather than just making it all about the differences. So those were just some of the things that come to mind for me on how we've kind of changed a way that we look at the expansion of membership, how we look at just the way in which we try to get connected leadership across different groups of allies. And the other thing that we really try to do is work with other external organizations, like other banks, our clients who are on the
Yeah.
buy side, because that makes it very clear that this isn't so much about us feeling like, oh, we're persecuted here. It is like we have these common goals and initiatives.
But you also can learn from each other, right? I mean,
Exactly.
my father said, it's a lot better to learn what other people have done right or wrong and then adopt that than do it yourself. He said, you could put your hand in a flame and learn that it's a bad idea, but it's a lot better if someone tells you not to do it and you just don't do it to begin with, right? One has a much happier, experience. Jenny, your view on
Sure.
how people figure out, what's best practices or how to implement things and so forth, particularly in the current environment.
Yeah, and that's a really important question, Peter, because often people want to do the right thing, they just don't know what to do. And what we saw often is that, when there's a demand for action, many organizations would just launch into doing a diversity training.
Yeah.
And a diversity training can mean a whole variety of things. It could mean implicit bias. It could mean teaching managers about the role of different systems and how they can change them. And one of the first things I did early at my tenure at OFCCP, because we were working on this device and diversity training issue, was to meet with some of the leading researchers on diversity trainings as well as practitioners. And they were sort of in agreement that many times organizations would just jump to say, we need to do something, let's do diversity training. And actually the research on what kinds of trainings work, it's like very mixed. And often organizations weren't actually starting with the first question of like, what is our objective? What are the problems we're trying to solve for with our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts? And the best way to answer that question is to talk with your employees across it at different levels to really identify where some of the pain points are, what the opportunities are, and that then really informs a broader strategy. But what the research does show is that like a one-shot diversity training has really no effect and can sometimes cause backlash, and done poorly has become fodder for various lawsuits, because we saw a lot of experimentation that wasn't grounded in research. But there is a robust body of research in this space. The industrial organizational psychology field is one that is very closely working in the EO space. And so for hiring, for example, there is a whole, body of work on how you identify job-related criteria, how you screen for them in an interview process. It isn't hiring from the most elite organizations. And a lot of the historical ways we think are job-related actually aren't. So actually like going back to some of the basics is really an opportunity here that I'm hoping this sort of rethinking of DEI will open the door to, so that companies in the course of evaluating their programs for legal risk and the new administration coming in will actually take a look at, is this working? Not just is this creating legal risk, but is this actually moving the needle? Is it answering the concerns that our employees have raised? And how do we ensure these programs need to iterate? You don't just adopt it and think you're done. You have to continually evaluate and improve upon this work. And that's the only way to see that moving forward. But I'll mention one other report that, when I was at EOC, this was before the Me Too movement, we just saw rampant harassment of all forms: sex discrimination, race, disability, And I asked two of my colleagues on a bipartisan basis, one was a Democrat, one was a Republican appointee, to lead a working group to better understand what more could employers doing to prevent harassment. And then when the Me Too movement happened, they had issued a very extensive report reviewing the research on how to prevent and respond to harassment. And one of the takeaways was like, a lot of the harassment training you're doing is not working at all. And you really need to understand the risk factors that exist in an organizational culture for harassment. And here are some of the concrete practices you can put in place. So I do think that more work needs to be done in trying to make the research more accessible to employers so that they're putting their resources into programs that are truly working.
Yeah. So, one of the things I take away from what the two you're saying is there's really no cookbook you can just grab and buy at Barnes and Noble that says, here's the cookbook on, how, well, you can go and get one for how to make a souffle or how to set up a HR department or whatever, but there's no cookbook that says, here's how you set up DEI related things and how do you adjust it, which is unfortunate, but it just means that you have to yourself have to figure out, how to do it. But one thing you can do is learn from other people. And I think Joyce's comment, which is a very good one, which is, look, it's not just an Asian American group, they're different groups. There are other groups, whether it's, Jewish America, whatever. And boy, each one, particularly like in the political arena, which Asian Americans in general have not been successful at getting enough people elected, et cetera, we can learn a lot from others. I want to turn to the last question before we open up to, we have at least one or two questions, which is, I would like each of you to look into your crystal ball out 5 or 10 years. And what do you think the landscape is going to look like for DEI? And what are the tools and practices that will be allowed when we get there? Joyce, you want to start out?
Yeah, well, I think you have to look at the overall demographics first of all. So when you just look at sort of the way the population is aging out, is that younger people are communicate differently. There's a greater use of social media. They're not using sort of a lot of the more traditional mediums. So I think that sort of traditional ways in which we have done things will be challenged more. There's more that will sort of have to be out there on some form of social media that's sort of more individualized to engage people in the way that they pick up and process information. But if you also look at the demographics, and we saw this at the last election, I mean, you have just more and more of the population, which is a mix. So if it is that, well, like, boy, it's this many immigrants, you also will have like sort of mixed race, younger people, and sort of will you, when you sort of total all of the different minority groups, actually kind of exceed the white population, and how do you sort of navigate that? And also that you have much more sort of blending that's going on now when you look at younger generations. So I think communication strategy, even the way that you message, the way that one talks about diversity, that's not just on gender and race, but on many other spectrums, is just going to increase going forward. So it's going to be really important, I think, for organizations to figure out which communication strategies are most helpful. And I think Jenny makes a really good point, like, is like a single DEI training is not the way that you're going to actually affect change and necessarily compel people to be part of your cause. How are you going to sort of engage people in a way where they feel that their impact is evident and that they are represented by the organization?
Yeah, in fact, that's a very, very interesting point, because I do think you point out how the world changed, technology changed, and so forth. And one of the takeaways when we had this great panel with 4 millennials who talked about the overall problem, and they basically said, hey, look, those people in leadership, you have to think ahead and think that the way things are going to operate, the way things are going to change, and the way to communicate is going to be very different. So if you don't adapt to that and anticipate how it's going to change, you may be successful, but you're not going to be as successful as you would otherwise. Jenny, your comment? Crystal ball, right?
You know, we're in a period of pendulum swing, right? So some thought the work went too far one way and may not have been implemented always in the way that was intended. I was just really surprised to hear in the course of these conversations over the last few years how many people actually didn't understand that under equal opportunity laws, you actually are not permitted to consider race, gender, or other protected bases in an employment decision. There's a separate narrow affirmative action provision to correct, past discrimination or manifest imbalance, but most of the work is not in that. But I think often in implementation, even if designed in a way that would not authorize or permit the consideration of race, there wasn't enough work put into communicating the implementation. So I think one of the things that we're doing right now is sort of clarifying what the law is, how it operates, how these programs are actually supposed to work. And so I think, we have this sort of swing in the other direction where some are saying this work is counter to merit. And what I hope to see in 5 or 10 years for people to understand that the work of diversity, equity, inclusion is not in tension with merit-based decision-making and hiring the most qualified people for the job. It is very much designed to remove the barriers so those who have been historically underestimated and not given the opportunities actually have those opportunities. This work is not about zero-sum picking one favored group over another. Equality and equal opportunity and diversity, equity, inclusion is like air, and there should be enough of it for everyone. So I hope we will have an equilibrium in 5 or 10 years, hopefully sooner rather than later, where organizations understand that this is not about saying you're doing the thing. It is about doing the work and the practices to create better systems that are more fair for everyone. A fair pay system helps everyone, including white men, including Asian Americans and others, and that employers are willing to listen to employees. In the consulting work I've done, we'd go in. Employees would come in focus groups. They'd sit there with crossed arms and be like, I wasn't going to say anything, but because you're here, it makes me think maybe the company's actually willing to do it. And they would start opening up about the changes they wanted to see. And where a company is responsive, right? There is really just goodwill on both sides from those efforts. So I really hope to see more of that in 5 or 10 years where there is that exchange and real commitment to practice change that benefits everyone.
Now we have a couple questions. We have a couple minutes left. I want to make one comment and just a personal comment. And it is my hope that all of these terms thrown around, DEI, ERG, or whatever, that the one phrase I hope becomes a thing that unifies everyone in an acceptable way is a level playing field. That's, you get the best people and a level playing field. And it's my hope that if we focus a lot of that you'll have fewer, attacks and so forth. There still will be, but I think it's, in a sense, a lot of the DEI things are really, their main purpose is quite a level playing field for qualified people. So among these questions, there's one that's really great. That's just somebody says, how do I network with the panelists? So I have your name and their email address, so I'll help you expedite that. But that's not a question for the general audience. There's one which is kind of an interesting question. I'm not sure how to deal with it, but I'm going to read it anyway. Mr. or Ms. Anonymous Attendee says, it's pretty clear that the new presidential administration demands loyalty tests to serve and or be in good standing with their various extreme leaders and interests. For Asian Americans, Americans of Asian origin who are in public service, who have private sector roles that intersect with the public policy areas, how do we do our part to influence AAPIs who want to serve the new administration while at the same time staying true to our values? It's a little complicated question, may or may not be something, the panelists want to answer, but I just thought it would be interesting to at least read it. Joyce or Jenny, any response to that question?
Jenny, go ahead. I can.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that I do think serving in government is an important public service. It's important to have institutional knowledge for our national security, for our economy, for systems to work smoothly. So I do think it's important for people to be willing to serve across administrations. We had people at EOC who'd been there since nearly the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that knowledge was so valuable. So I do think it's important for people to be willing to serve, but also to be true to who they are and their values, and also to be ready to leave if they feel like those values are being compromised. I think that's true in any organization where you would work. But I also think it's important for the Asian American community to be organized, to make sure that where we think members of our community are being unfairly targeted because of their race or ethnicity, and we have seen racial profiling, unfortunately, of Asian Americans, particularly in national security and scientific areas, where we see that targeting, discrimination, and profiling, it's very important for the community to organize and to make our voice heard, because that is very powerful and can call attention to processes that need to be changed, people that need to be changed, and education that needs to be done to ensure that our community is not targeted for some mistaken notions of loyalty.
Joyce, last word to the audience.
Yeah, so a lot of what I do as a research analyst is I convene people. So I think it's very important not to just say, well, I don't agree with these people, so I'm not going to talk to them. Is that it is important that you can be a convener that can bring in a real diversity, of views. And so, look, I feel like a lot of the rhetoric on the China tariffs is just factually incorrect. As far as what the implications are for growth and inflation and for exchange rates. So a lot of what I end up doing is so I may not be part of the government, but to say that, look, we need to have this forum so that you meet the right people, you understand what the market consequences are. This is the research that we've produced. We understand there's a wide range of views, but to me, this is a time that's more important than ever, that you're not inward looking, that you're sort of outward in making sure that there are these forums where you're convening and trying as hard as possible not to pass judgment, but to get information out there that sort of on its own objective will be able to be something that people can look at the scenarios, process it, and then think about what the consequences are. I think it's really important, also that we look at the communication channels and how to get information out in different ways. And what we really could see is look, we're not in a world anymore where people watch 60 Minutes on Sunday and then they come up with their view. I mean, kind of look at just what the dynamics were in this election on sort of what moved public opinion. So it's important, I think, to sort of embrace some of the people who may not have your views, to say that, look, you can express them here. We may not all agree, but we need to have the way in which we're continuing the dialogue and having the communication continue, irrespective of what our differences are.
Well, we've ended, we had some additional questions. Some of them are actually comments, and I'm just going to pass them on to the panelists, suggestions or ideas. So they really weren't questions. And so those of you who type those in, I will share them with Jenny and Joyce. And they were very thoughtful, by the way. They just weren't posed as questions. I want to thank our two panelists. This has been a wonderful perspective. I particularly like the fact that the two of you really look at it from a, from a different angle. I hope that over the next, my crystal ball, I hope that the next 5-10 years things get better, but it's going to require, a fair amount of work. One thing that we're trying to do as Committee 100 is to act as a convener, as a collaborator, whatever. We don't, I guess we're not really Asian Americans because we don't want to control our little space and be the king of the world, but our job is to bring people in from the different organizations and have them talk to each other. And one such effort was July 17th, where we had a summit, and we brought together 40 people who were heads of different DEI groups and so forth. And we said, we want you to talk to each other. We want you to share ideas. And then at the end, they all got in small groups with the task that they had to come up with 2 ideas that no one had thought of that could be implemented. That was very successful. And then we had another, I think, 100 people or so by virtual audience, but that went really well. So we're probably going to do it again in June. And we hope to see many of you who are in the audience who are involved as officers of DEI and ERG groups to join us then. So, so I want to thank the two panelists. I want to thank the attendees for your good questions and attention. And we really want all of you to dial in tomorrow so you can create your personal brand according to Joyce's plea that you do so, right? And I want to thank all of you. So we look forward to seeing you at future events. And again, thank you, Jenny and Joyce. This has been recorded. So Jenny, if you want your relatives to binge watch this and watch it over and over again, you'll be able to do that. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks. Bye-bye.